Welcome, everyone, to this special live event from Fictionary, hosted exclusively for the Fictionary community. Today, we're welcoming editor Crystal Shelley to talk about conscious language and authenticity readers. So this should be a fantastic half hour for all the writers and editors in this wonderful community. My name is James Gallagher, and I'm a copy editor, the owner of Castle Walls Editing, and a Fictionary certified StoryCoach editor. And this is a big thrill for me, as I've never had a chance to talk with Crystal before, but I've long followed her on social media and been able to view some of her presentations in other venues. And I use her conscious language toolkit for editors almost every day. I've long benefited from the resources she produces, and I have unending respect for her work, and for the way that she approaches her work. From the ACES website, Crystal Shelley is the owner of Rabbit with a Red Pen, which is also one of my favorite editor agency names. Where she provides editing and authenticity reading services to fiction authors. Drawing on her background as a social worker, she unites her love of language and her passion for social justice by advocating conscious language use and inclusive representation in her editorial work. She is the creator of the Conscious Language Toolkit for editors and writers, and serves on the board of ACES, the Society for Editing. Before we meet Crystal, I want to announce that at the end of this episode, we'll be giving away a free copy of our Conscious Language Toolkit for writers to one of our attendees. Crystal has also very graciously extended a 20% discount on her toolkit, available at our website, rabbitwitharedpen.com, using the code Fictionary at checkout. Very generous and very much appreciated. So for the next half hour, we're going to talk about conscious language, authenticity reading, and Crystal's helpful toolkit. This can be an interactive session, so when questions arise, feel free to raise your hand or drop questions in the chat, and we'll address them, and also leave a few minutes for questions at the end of the half hour. So, Crystal, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, to get started, I want to say my career certainly hasn't been a straight line, and it's always interesting to see how people arrived where they are in the editing world. So would you like to tell us a bit about your background and how you got started as an authenticity reader?
Yeah, so as James mentioned, I have a background in social work. So my schooling has been in psychology, and then I got my master's in social work, never thinking that I would ever be in editing, although I always loved it. I always loved grammar. Friends would ask me to look over their papers, proofread them, things like that in school, which I enjoyed doing, but I never thought to pursue that. I always wanted to go into a helping profession. So I got my master's in social work, and then worked in hospice care and memory care. So working with people who had Alzheimer's and related dementias. So I did that for 10 years. And then during kind of the last part of that, I knew someone personally who was an editor, and I started beta reading for her just as part of her package of services she provided to authors. And as I did that, I would notice things, both with representation and with, mechanical editing, and commented on that. And she encouraged me to pursue editing. So when there was some turmoil in my job as a social worker, I started to slowly kind of look at other options. And then I decided to start my own business and get training and all of that in editing. So as far as authenticity reading, that was newer. I had heard of, what many people call sensitivity reading, didn't know a whole lot about it, but I was reading a novel called Warcross by Marie Lu. It's a young adult sci-fi novel that features a Chinese American protagonist. And I was just reading that for fun. I had heard recommendations about it, and it really hit me that I didn't really have that growing up. I'm in my mid-30s, and as a kid, there were very few times where I saw people who look like me, especially Chinese Americans. If I watched media produced in Asia. Of course, that was full of people who look like me, but not people whose parents had immigrated to the States and had experiences like I did. So just reading that book, it kind of aligned with the time where I had just started my business and was exploring what I really wanted to do as an editor. And through that, I realized I want to look more into this. And so I did. And then I started offering services related to authenticity reading. And so a lot of what I read for now is Chinese culture, Chinese American representation, and things like that. So that's how I got started.
Well, the editing community, and by extension, many writers are very lucky that the path you took found you here. So in just to kind of set the stage a little bit, what do we mean when we say conscious language?
Yeah, so conscious language is a term that was coined by a writer and editor named Karen Yin. She started the website Conscious Style Guide, and some of you may have heard of it, may use it, but she started it in 2015. And really, she defines it as language that's rooted in critical thinking and compassion, used skillfully in a specific context. I'm pretty sure I don't have that in front of me. I've just given enough presentations about it and used her quote that I think that's what she says. But really, it's about using, like she said, language. But I think a lot of us hear about political correctness and how we want to avoid offending other people or getting into trouble for saying the wrong thing. But what conscious language has really done is reframed that into thinking about how we can use language in an intentional way. And when we do so, to think about how we can be respectful to our audience, to our readers, in not producing or not using language that is often unintentionally exclusive or biased, or coming from, we all come from our own defaults, our own experiences. So we write from that, and we don't always know that we might be harming our readers, but encouraging all of us to rethink language, rethink what we commonly use, and feel like it's okay because, oh, well, everyone says that word or that phrase, so of course nothing's wrong with it. But really challenging us to consider how historically a lot of the language you use has been shaped by those who are in power, those who are privileged, and maybe used to marginalize or oppress people who are underrepresented. So really thinking about all of our readers and all of our audience, and considering how our language may be playing into these systems that we don't always think about are unjust.
It's interesting too how even our language about language, when we talk about using a term like conscious language, affects our approach to it.
Right. And that's why, growing up, I was like, oh, well, I always thought of myself as being politically correct, and not, of course, later on recognizing how that has, huge, these connotations with using that term that are often negative. But I would think of it as like, oh, I'm just trying to be respectful of other people. But when I found Conscious Style Guide and that framework that Karen uses, I was like, oh, this is a much better way of talking about it, of thinking about it, and where it's not so politically charged when we're talking about language. So.
Yeah. And communication is always so important in any kind of editing.
For sure.
And we have a lot of writers and editors here both. I know that you touched on this a little bit, but sometimes you hear the term authenticity reading, which I know you favor, and sometimes you hear the term sensitivity reading. So what are the differences there, if any, and what is your approach to using those terms?
Yeah, there are a lot of terms for a lot of services that are pretty similar. I see I use sensitivity reading and authenticity reading interchangeably. I think some people may have specific definitions that are separate. So I really struggled when I was coming up with, like, how do I market my service? What do I even call it? So at first I started with targeted beta reading because that was a way I heard it referenced. And I like that idea that, I think writers are used to hiring beta readers, getting that feedback, but might be more resistant to sensitivity reading or authenticity reading. And so I liked to think of it as, oh, well, this is like beta reading, but from a targeted point of view or perspective. But then I'm like, oh, I don't know, like SEO wise, is anyone going to be able to find what I offer if I call it that? So then I went to sensitivity reading. But in talking with other people in publishing, reading articles, and right now there are so many articles about sensitivity reading, I was thinking more and more about, like, what makes people resistant to engaging with these services. And one of the biggest criticisms, which I think is a big misconception, is that, oh, this only exists because people are hypersensitive to offending other people. And so the idea or the name sensitivity reading can kind of play into that idea, like, oh, people are sensitive, and so they need, to have their hands held and not be exposed to any bad things, that kind of thing. So when I was thinking about, like, is that yes, it's the most common name used in publishing, but does that mean it's the best name? And so, I had heard of the term authenticity reading, and as I was rethinking what I wanted to use for my service name, I decided that I liked that better because, and there's a drawback in using that, in that there is an idea where there might be one authentic experience, which is not true, but there can be gatekeeping where someone might say, oh, well, that person's experience is not authentic. Well, what does that mean? And I like the term authenticity reading because I don't see it as it's an authentic experience, but it's a reader who's reading from what's authentic to them. And so I like that because I feel like it's more true to what the service is, in that it's trying to offer this perspective, this lived experience from identity that is authentic to the reader. So yes, there are going to be drawbacks to any name, but that's why I use that rather than sensitivity reading. But I recognize that many people many people are familiar with sensitivity reading more.
Well, since you mentioned gatekeeping, there has been a large awareness of a lack of maybe diversity in big publishing. Do you see? I mean, having conversations like this, for one, is at least in some way a good sign that we're even having the conversations. But do you see good progress being made in this publishing, and what do you see for that kind of issues around gatekeeping and for people trying to break into big publishing?
Yeah, so I mainly work with indie authors. I run my own business. I'm not in publishing. I do work with some publishers. So I don't have the insights into what the publishing landscape really looks like. Lee and Low has done their diversity baseline survey. Started in 2015 and they redid it in 2019. I'm not sure if they plan to redo the survey anytime soon, but basically they surveyed US publishers, and of those that responded, both in 2015 and 2019, they found that the publishing industry is overwhelmingly made up of white, cisgender, non-disabled women. And so when that's the case, it's not to say that there isn't there aren't diverse voices in publishing. But I think what they found, and again, this was just in reading their results, so I don't have all the information, but that especially lower level, like entry level jobs and internships, there's a lot of diversity there. But as you move higher up, then I think that diversity starts to go away. Mainly, I think because of low pay, a lot of the requirements of living in New York City, although I think with the pandemic that has changed some internships, but not many opportunities to move into permanent positions, high rates of burnout, a lot of different factors that might be keeping people out of publishing. And so what that often looks like is that, or what it often results in is that things don't always get caught. When stories are written by people who look like the agents that are acquiring them, the editors who are working on them, then if there are harmful depictions, if there are stereotypes and tropes and things like that, then it doesn't always get caught in the process. Or if it maybe they do hire an authenticity reader, but it's one person out of many people on this publishing team, and if no one else sees a problem with the representation or the language that's used, then it may be less likely that something will be done about it. So a lot of people have talked about how publishing has a diversity issue, and it's not just numbers. It ripples into what books are getting acquired, what's the content that's being produced. So I think there's a lot more awareness, especially in the last few years, but that doesn't mean things have magically been fixed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly a month ago, on March 4th, on Grammar Day, we talked to the fabulous Ellen Joven, and that was a lot of fun. And one of the most interesting parts for me of that talk was her approach to language, because she's out there actually, in the world, talking face to face to people about an often contentious subject of grammar. And there's often, contention around issues of conscious language as well. So I thought her approach is fantastic, sort of one of curiosity and of listening. And I know on your website you talk about a philosophy of editing, of a dignified, intentional, and just. So what is your philosophy toward your approach to language in this area?
I mean, language it's very complicated. It's very personal. The language each of us uses is very personal to us. It's a reflection of who we are, where we live, what we believe, even if that's unconsciously. And so because our writing is personal, the stories we tell are personal, then I always keep that in mind when I am working with writers, because it can be hard to have our language critiqued and assessed. And I think it's one thing too. I mean, with Ellen, her whole thing is grammar and language. So that on its own can be contentious. But I think even more so when we're talking about the language we use, just every day, when we're using everyday phrases, and then someone not only tells us we've spelled something incorrectly or use an apostrophe in the wrong place, but we're being told that's offensive or that's racist. That that adds a whole nother layer of complication of how we feel about what the other person is telling us and about ourselves. I think for the most part, most of us think we're each good people, and the language we use doesn't mean that that we aren't good people, but it can feel like that when someone is telling us that, the language, what you said really hurt me, or, that has racist origins. It can, really make us, feel all sorts of complicated emotions, defensive or guilty, or, um, you name it. So I think when I work with authors, I try to keep that in mind when I'm giving feedback, um, normalizing that, hey, this phrase is used, very commonly, everyone uses it. At the same time, there's this history with this word, or your readers may, while many of them aren't gonna notice this, some of them are, and this is why, and this is how we can rethink this or rework this, or, these are some other options that you might want to consider instead. Always knowing that, the writer has the final say, but I'm there to be a partner to help them make sure that they're choosing the words, the messaging that they want to, because so much of our language, again, is common. So it's unintentional when we do say things, because that's what we know. And so when we aren't aware that, that there's this history, or that this population may be affected by it in a way that we're not, then I'm always trying to assume good intent. And I think that's a good rule for us in in everyday life, assuming that for the most part people have good intentions. Um, and I know for myself, like, if there are plenty of times where someone has raised an issue to me where I may have used language that is harmful, and I have those reactions too. I try to think about how it's not about me. Yes, it might be the language I use, but ultimately it's not about me. It's about how that is affecting those around me. Again, particularly the groups who are most affected by it. And so, so when I am aware of something, then I get to make a choice, right? I get to either keep going the way I'm going and continue to use that language, but I'm doing so purposefully from then on, rather than from a place of not knowing, or I can choose to change that language. And so to me, I see it as like I'm there to help empower the writers to make the right choice for their work. And whether they agree with that, or whether they do make a change, that's completely up to them.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, and it's important, to underscore that um, editing at every level is essentially a conversation between the author and the editor, and um, I think people often feel that it's a contentious relationship, but it really isn't, and it's important to keep in mind that at every level, editors are always offering suggestions, and
Right.
ultimately, especially indie publishing, the author has complete control over what they'd like to accept or not accept. And also that it is very easy to be defensive. So that idea of recognizing that and sort of being kind to yourself and saying, that's a natural reaction, but I can now stop and listen and consider.
Right.
So an author has a manuscript. They found you. They've heard great things about you. They think they're ready for authenticity reading. A read on their manuscript. Where there's so many layers of the editing process: and developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, proofreading, beta reading. You have critique partners. Where do you most commonly take an authenticity read within that process?
Yeah, so I usually suggest the earlier the better in the process, just because I'd hate for an author to have gone through like a copy edit, or hopefully not a proofread, but even at the copy editing stage, it's fairly late in the game. So if there are like certain language things, like, that's not a big deal. But if it's but if I'm suggesting that, hey, this character, there are some more in-depth level changes that I would recommend, that would be pretty hard to do for the author at that point, or it would cost more time and money. So I recommend earlier in the process. Some people will, especially if they know that the character they're creating, or perhaps they are this is going to play into the plot in a big way. They might work with a reader or a consultant in even developing the story. So that's always a possibility too. But usually after a developmental edit, perhaps line editing, then I might see the manuscript. It really just depends. But I always recommend, like, yeah, once you have the story written, then it's best, like, before you get into the actual line work and especially the copy editing, it's usually good to get someone involved for that feedback.
Yeah. And our half hour has been flying by.
I know, I'm looking at the time, I'm like, really, we've been talking for that long already? But
well, I want to get this out, that we are giving away one of your conscious language toolkits for writers. So if one of the attendees, we'd like to give this to the first person to type conscious language into the chat.
oh, you're not even asking a question, you're just testing speed of typing.
Yeah, I know. I should have asked a question. Maybe that would have been better.
Okay, so it looks like Jen Bladen was the first person to type conscious language into the chat.
Yay, congratulations. You're going to love the toolkit. That's a great introduction to the toolkit. Jen, if you'd like to, you can find me in the community and direct message me, and I'll get that to you. And if for some reason you can't find me, Shane or Lucy will pass that on too. But congratulations. And Crystal, do you want to tell us about this wonderful resource? I'll say, even copy editing, I use it all the time. It gives me the tools to, if I see something, I can point authors to a resource, and I have the language to communicate to them why something might be an issue. So
yeah, so the toolkit, there are two versions, as James had talked about. There's one for editors and one for writers, and I started with the one for editors because that's where I saw the need. So I'd come across, a word or a phrase that I would want to flag for writers to be aware of, like, hey, like, take the word crazy, for example. Very commonly used. Almost everyone uses it in many different contexts. But I think more and more people are talking about the ableist origins of it, how it's been used to stigmatize people with mental illness. And so, so I would come across a word that I want to flag, and usually I have to come up with the comment language. Well, one, I have to be aware of it, as I myself, as an editor, have to be aware that I might want to consider talking to the author about that. Maybe not in all contexts, but that level of awareness, first of all. And then I'd have to come up with the language of how to write the query. I like to provide a resource to provide, or to point the author to, here's where you can find more information about that if you want to, alternatives that they can consider instead. So I was like doing all this legwork for all these words and phrases I would find. And then, and there are so many resources out there that talk about different aspects of language, but it was hard to find somewhere that had it all in one spot. And so I started like putting all this information, like pulling information from all these resources I would find. And then I basically compiled it into this giant PDF, broken down into sections like race, nationality, and origin, gender, appearance and body size, things like that. And I created tables of, the word or phrase, the why you should be aware of it, alternatives, and a resource. So for the editor version, I also put in query language that editors could plug in to make it faster for them, because it is a lot of work for us to do that, especially if we're each doing it on our own. So I wanted to make it maybe a little easier for them. The writer one doesn't have the queries because for the most part, I don't think writers would be writing that, but it has all of the tables and of the words and phrases and all the resources, plus just additional places to go like Conscious Style Guide and, Trans Journalists Association, National Center of Disability on Disability and Journalism, various style guides that exist out there, all listed in one place. So that's the inspiration.
And it is an absolutely fantastic resource. I know in my copy editing work, it's essential. I love having it. And I did also want to say, with I was looking at the acknowledgements, reading through the new Chicago Guide to Copy Editing Fiction. There's a conscious language section there. You were among a few thanked in the acknowledgements for contributing to that. So your work finds its way through your guide, through editors, through resources like that, through your own work. So you're doing a lot of work that's getting out there and doing a lot of good. We're at the half hour, but maybe we have time for one question. Was there a question in the chat, Shane or Lucy?
So we had a couple questions, but I'll start with this one. So Jen asked, how do you read for authenticity in areas where you don't have personal experience?
Right. Yeah. So I kind of separate the two. So just as far as concepts, because I've been approached like, hey, will you do a sensitivity read on this, when really it's talking about like more a broader approach, like a more global look for language that that has, that might be racist, gendered, ableist, and the like. So that I look at just through my own education, through constantly trying to keep up with language change, although it's hard to do and it can be really overwhelming. But knowing what resources and guides are out there and being able to point writers to that. So that's what I do for what I call a conscious language assessment. But I separate that from my authenticity reads, which I only do from certain perspectives. So as I mentioned, like reading for Chinese culture, I also read for Alzheimer's and dementia and hospice care. Even though I don't have lived experience in those fields, I have my practice as a social worker, so I can read for general depictions of them. So that I do differently, although I incorporate my conscious language feedback into every authenticity read I do. But I don't know if that answers the question, but it can be, I don't think anyone's a true expert in everything, but it's knowing what resources are out there and being able to point authors to guides, or if I see that there's a lot of language related to this one topic and maybe some of it seems a little off or just not quite where it needs to be, then I might recommend that they reach out to someone who does have expertise in that specific area. So.
Did we have one other question? I know we're well past now, but
yeah, so interesting question. How about writing different classes? I'm not sure if the exact question I'm asking, but this conversation is making me feel a little apprehensive. I'm assuming Bonnie means about writing about different classes.
So classes like socioeconomic classes or different identities? Or
I assumed you meant socioeconomic, Bonnie, but if you could just clarify in the chat.
And for anyone's question I don't get to, you can always email me, if I can answer it for you that way.
Um,
I don't know if y'all put like in the event information, like my contact information.
we
but-
can do, yeah. I'll add that to
Okay.
the event for sure. Bonnie said yes, socioeconomic.
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of it is going to be authenticity reading too, I should say, often well, not just authenticity reading, but just care and consideration is particularly important when writing about groups that are underrepresented or marginalized. So if like a person is writing about, upper class life, that's not so much about like, am I going to do harm in that way? It's more about, is it going to be, accurate or believable? Not to say though that's not an important thing, but especially if a writer wants to write about someone from, someone who is from a low socioeconomic class and doesn't have experience living that way, then that's where more harm can be done, because there are so many stereotypes and harmful tropes that can be written. So not just class, but across any type of social identity category. Is that the case? And so with class in particular, there are some resources. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to write. But there are, I'm aware of some resources that write about, that recommend like how journalists can cover stories that are about lower socioeconomic families and neighborhoods, because so much harm can be done there. But as far as like, how do you write about it? It really just depends on what the story is, what the goals are, that kind of thing. So it's hard to really, for me to like give an explanation or advice there. So apologize.
Well, Crystal, thank you so much for being here. If you don't mind staying on for just one more minute as we close out the room, we'll thank you again in our version of the green room. But thank you everyone else so much for coming today. I hope you learned a lot. You can learn more rabbitwitharedpen.com. Crystal has lots of great resources, lots of great blogs. And also don't forget to check the Fictionary event schedule. Lots of great events coming up too. So thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Crystal.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
And everyone have a great rest of the day.